The heat of the late summer afternoon hung over Magnolia Falls like a comforting, heavy quilt. Caleb Whitmore stood quietly on his porch, worn boots creaking against old, weathered boards. He watched dust rise slowly from the dirt road, disappearing into the golden sunlight that danced lazily through swaying branches of towering oaks. The hum of cicadas filled the silence, a familiar lullaby in this sleepy southern town. For Caleb, every day was the same, waking alone in the house he'd once shared with Emily, a house that still echoed with her laughter, even after 5 years. He glanced back inside, where time seemed frozen. Her photographs still lined the mantel, her favorite quilt still draped over the rocking chair she'd always loved. Duke, his old bloodhound, lay by his feet, tongue lolling in quiet companionship. Caleb had grown comfortable in his isolation, convinced that this was how his life was meant to be now, quiet, still, uninterrupted. It was safer that way, easier somehow. But today, the gentle monotony was shattered by the distant rumble of an engine and a puff of red dirt swirling like cinnamon in the air. Caleb straightened, squinting down the road at a battered blue pickup truck he didn't recognize, its bed loaded with boxes and a suitcase or two. He watched warily as it pulled up to the vacant cottage just across the street. It had been empty for months, ever since old Mrs. Landry moved to live closer to her daughter in Birmingham. The new arrival drew curtains back in every window, letting light flood the tiny space. Duke lifted his head with a curious whine. Caleb gave him a dismissive pat. "It's nothing, boy." But then the truck's door swung open, and out hopped a young woman with a mess of sun-kissed hair escaping from under a broad, straw hat. Caleb watched silently as she stretched and spun slowly, taking in her new home with visible delight. She wore a sundress of brightest yellow, and, even from this distance, Caleb sensed a brightness about her, a brightness that felt strangely foreign, out of place in his gray-shaded world. She began to unload her belongings with surprising energy, humming to herself in a voice as sweet as honeysuckle on a warm night. Caleb told himself to look away, to retreat inside, but something kept him rooted. Her energy was almost mesmerizing, relentless, and genuine. Everything about her spoke of life, of movement, of change. All things Caleb had spent years avoiding. He sighed, turning back inside when suddenly, Duke perked up, barking sharply. Caleb turned to find the woman marching toward his house, carrying a covered basket, her smile radiant and unafraid. He stiffened. No one ever visited him anymore. Magnolia Falls had learned, over time, to let Caleb Whitmore be. "Hi there," she called, waving as though they were old friends. "Thought I'd come introduce myself. I'm Savannah Leigh Monroe. Just moved into the cottage across the street." Caleb stayed still, uncertain, hoping she'd stop if he gave her no encouragement. But she kept coming, her boots crunching across his gravel driveway, sunlit hair bouncing with every cheerful step. She stopped just below his porch steps, offering the basket as peace offering. "It's peach cobbler. My mama's recipe," she said. "I've been handing them out all afternoon. Thought you might like some too." Caleb cleared his throat, uneasy under the weight of her smile. "Appreciate the gesture," he managed, his voice rough from disuse, "but I'm not much for company." Her expression didn't dim a bit. Instead, her smile softened, understanding and undaunted. "That's all right," she said warmly, setting the basket gently on the bottom step. "No strings attached. But if you ever change your mind, my door's always open." He nodded stiffly, saying nothing more. She turned away, heading back across the road, humming cheerfully as though nothing unusual had occurred. Caleb exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside his chest, a tiny, unsettling ripple in the still pond of his solitude. Duke sniffed the basket eagerly, tail wagging as if he'd made a new friend. Caleb stared down at the fragrant offering, wondering at this new, relentlessly sunny force who had invaded his quiet world. She was unlike anyone he'd encountered in a long time, unafraid of rejection, unfazed by his walls. Already, he sensed she wouldn't give up easily. Magnolia Falls had always been a town that didn't change much. But as Caleb watched Savannah disappear inside her cottage, a sinking feeling told him that perhaps, just perhaps, nothing would ever be the same again. It had been nearly a week since Savannah Monroe had rolled into Magnolia Falls like a summer storm, and Caleb Whitmore found himself caught somewhere between irritation and intrigue. She had quickly made herself a fixture in the community, filling the old diner with her laughter, volunteering at the library, charming neighbors young and old alike. Yet she never forgot him, either. Every morning, she waved cheerfully from her porch when he ventured out to tend his small garden. Every evening, she smiled brightly from across the road as he sat on his porch, watching the sunset in silence. Caleb was stubborn. He ignored her waves and pretended not to notice her sunny greetings. But even he couldn't deny that something about her felt like a breath of fresh air. It annoyed him almost as much as it intrigued him. She didn't belong here, not in the stillness of his carefully constructed world. Savannah was laughter and noise and movement, things he had spent years avoiding. But today, Savannah Leigh Monroe refused to be ignored. Caleb was repairing a fence behind his house, sweat dripping down his brow under the blazing sun, when he heard footsteps approaching from the front. He straightened, wiping his forehead with a faded handkerchief as he turned to see Savannah walking boldly toward him. She carried 2 glasses of sweet iced tea, her sundress fluttering around her knees in the warm breeze. "Good afternoon, Caleb," she called cheerfully, as if it was perfectly normal to wander into someone's backyard uninvited. "Looks like you could use a break." Caleb sighed, hammer still in hand. He looked around as if searching for an escape route, but Duke was already bounding over, tail wagging wildly at Savannah's appearance. "Traitor," Caleb thought bitterly. "Miss Monroe," he said stiffly. "I'm busy." "I can see that," she replied, unfazed, stepping closer and holding out 1 glass toward him. Her blue eyes sparkled mischievously. "And I told you it's Savannah. Now, are you going to make me stand here in this heat all day, or will you have mercy and take a sip?" Caleb hesitated, watching beads of condensation trickle down the side of the glass. Her smile was relentless, her stubbornness unshakable. Grumbling quietly, he set down his hammer and reluctantly took the glass, feeling the icy coldness soothe his calloused hand. "Just a sip," he warned, but his voice had lost its edge. "Fair enough," she laughed, leaning against the fence beside him, gazing out over the rolling fields behind his property. She took a sip of her tea, eyes closing in pleasure. "It's beautiful out here." Caleb followed her gaze, feeling something tighten in his chest. It was beautiful, though he'd stopped seeing it a long time ago. Instead, he saw ghosts, Emily's laughter echoing across the fields, her silhouette dancing through the tall grass at sunset. He shook the memory away, forcing himself back into the present. "You shouldn't keep coming around," he said quietly, his voice rougher than intended. Savannah tilted her head, studying him with a curious intensity. "Why not?" "Because I don't want company." She smiled gently, her eyes softening with understanding. "Maybe you don't, but I think you need it." He stiffened, feeling exposed under her gaze. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe not," she admitted, her voice gentle yet unyielding. "But I know loneliness when I see it." Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he considered walking away, shutting her out as he had everyone else. But something in her expression, a fleeting shadow behind those sunny eyes, gave him pause. There was more to her than relentless sunshine. He recognized the haunted look in her eyes because it was the same one he saw in the mirror every morning. "Why do you care?" he finally asked, voice barely audible. Savannah looked away briefly, her smile fading for just a moment. When she met his eyes again, the sunshine was back, but softer now, tempered by something deeper. "Because sometimes we need someone to care, even if we push them away," she said quietly. "And because I've been where you are, stuck in the past, afraid to move forward. It's a lonely place." Her words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Caleb stared into his glass, feeling exposed yet strangely comforted by her admission. Savannah pushed off the fence, offering him a gentle smile. I'll get out of your hair now. But thank you for the company, Caleb. It was nice. She turned and walked slowly back toward her cottage, leaving Caleb to watch her retreating form. Duke whined softly at his feet, nudging his hand gently. Caleb exhaled heavily, taking another sip of the sweet tea that somehow tasted better than any he'd had in years. He glanced back toward Savannah's retreating figure, realizing she had given him more than tea and conversation. She had offered a glimpse of understanding, of shared pain, hidden beneath relentless sunshine. He didn't know what to do with that realization. But for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt a tiny spark of something that felt dangerously close to hope. The weather in Magnolia Falls could turn on a dime, and today was no exception. Afternoon sunlight had given way to dark, menacing clouds that rumbled ominously overhead. Savannah had spent the day at the library, helping Mrs. Cartwright shelve books and chatting cheerfully with locals who drifted in and out, eager for a chance to speak with the town's newest ray of sunshine. But now, as the first heavy drops of rain splattered against the sidewalk, she found herself stranded, her old pickup refusing to start. "Come on, girl," she pleaded, turning the key once more, only to hear the engine sputter weakly. Rain hammered harder, streaking down her windshield, blurring the outside world into a wash of gray. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed closely by a deep growl of thunder. With a frustrated sigh, she grabbed her umbrella from the passenger seat, pulled on a lightweight jacket, and began the long walk home. Her shoes quickly soaked through, and the wind whipped rain beneath her umbrella. Shivering, she ducked her head against the downpour, determined to keep moving. The road home passed by Caleb Whitmore's farmhouse, a fact Savannah didn't fully register until she was nearly upon it. A faint, golden light spilled from one window, offering a small beacon in the storm. She paused, staring at his door, wrestling with herself. Caleb had made it clear he wasn't interested in company, but the storm was relentless, and she was soaked through, trembling from cold. She took a deep breath, gathering courage before walking toward his porch. She knocked softly, then again louder, hoping he'd be merciful enough to let her wait out the worst of the storm inside. Caleb answered quickly, looking startled. He took in her drenched appearance with a mixture of surprise and concern. Without a word, he opened the door wider, gesturing her inside. "You're soaked," he murmured gruffly, grabbing a towel from a nearby chair and handing it to her. Savannah gratefully took it, wrapping it around herself as she stepped into the warmth of his home. It was the first time she'd been inside, and she felt an unexpected rush of emotion as her eyes took in the room. Everywhere, signs of the past lingered. Photographs of a smiling woman with dark hair lined the mantel, a beautiful quilt rested on the back of an old rocking chair, and a small pair of baby shoes sat on a dusty shelf, never worn. Savannah's heart ached for Caleb. The weight of loss was tangible here, pressing heavily upon her chest. Yet Caleb had made no move to erase these painful reminders. It was as if he'd chosen to live among the ghosts rather than let them go. "Thank you," she said quietly, glancing back at him. "My truck wouldn't start, and I thought I'd make it home before it got too bad." Caleb nodded silently, watching her closely, conflicted emotions swirling in his eyes. Finally, he motioned to a seat by the fireplace. "Sit. I'll make coffee." Surprised but grateful, Savannah obeyed, settling herself in the chair, the warmth of the fire quickly thawing her cold skin. Moments later, Caleb returned, handing her a steaming mug. He sat across from her, silent at first, eyes cast down at his coffee. "I'm sorry," Savannah said softly, glancing around the room. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," he replied gently, surprising her. Storms can be unpredictable around here. A quiet fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt strangely intimate, as though each was allowing the other a glimpse behind carefully constructed walls. Savannah took a sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth that spread through her body. "Your wife was beautiful," she said carefully, her eyes drifting to the photographs on the mantel. Caleb stiffened, his fingers tightening around his mug. Emily, he whispered, his voice catching. She was. Savannah heard the unspoken grief in his voice, saw the pain etched in his features. She knew that pain well, recognized its depths. A storm of emotion swelled inside her chest. I lost someone too, she said suddenly, surprising even herself with the admission. My mama. I was 13 when she passed. Caleb looked up, startled, meeting her gaze. His eyes were filled with raw understanding. He didn't offer empty condolences, didn't push for more, but his quiet presence urged her forward. She took her own life, Savannah continued, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't understand it then. Not really. But I've spent my whole life since then trying to save people from themselves, thinking if I could just do enough, care enough, I might make a difference. Tears shimmered in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't know why I told you that. Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set down his mug, moved to kneel before her, and took her trembling hand in his, offering a quiet strength that left her breathless. Thank you for telling me, he said softly, his voice a deep rumble of comfort. You're not alone in carrying those burdens, Savannah. She stared into his eyes, struck by the sudden intimacy, the silent acknowledgement of shared pain. For a moment, everything else faded, the storm, the past, even the future. It was just them, two souls finding solace in a shared moment of vulnerability. The storm outside began to quiet, leaving only gentle pattering against the window. Savannah offered him a soft, grateful smile. Neither are you, Caleb. He squeezed her hand gently before pulling away, suddenly aware of how close they had become. The storm's clearing. I'll give your truck a look in the morning. Savannah nodded, warmth blooming in her chest. I'd appreciate that. Caleb stood, offering a hand to help her up. As they walked to the door, he paused, turning to her, vulnerability lingering in his eyes. Come by any time. It's nice having someone here, even if I haven't been very welcoming. Savannah smiled softly, stepping out onto the porch. I'd like that. As she walked slowly back toward her cottage, Savannah felt lighter somehow, knowing she'd made a tiny crack in his armor. But more surprising was the realization that Caleb Whitmore had made an even deeper crack in hers. Sunrise came soft and golden to Magnolia Falls, painting Caleb Whitmore's farmhouse in shades of amber and rose. He stood at his kitchen window, coffee in hand, gaze fixed on Savannah's old pickup parked just across the road. She was still asleep, or so he assumed. He found himself wondering if she was all right, if yesterday's stormy encounter had left her shaken. Caleb's thoughts wandered back to the previous night, the way Savannah had opened up about her mother, the pain in her eyes as she spoke, and the quiet strength that had emerged from their shared vulnerability. It was the first real conversation he'd had in years. Caleb wasn't sure how he felt about it yet, whether it was a relief or something terrifyingly fragile. After finishing his coffee, Caleb stepped outside into the bright morning, tools in hand, and crossed the dusty road to Savannah's driveway. He didn't have to do this. He could have called Hank's boy from the garage to take a look. But something compelled him to do it himself, a quiet urge to make things right, to offer help in the only way he knew how. As he opened the hood of the truck, Duke wandered over from the porch, sniffing curiously at Caleb's boots before settling beside him. The engine was old but sturdy, familiar territory for Caleb, who had spent countless hours repairing machinery on his own farm. He lost himself in the work, soothed by the routine task. A half-hour passed before Caleb heard footsteps approaching. He glanced up, wiping grease from his hands, to see Savannah walking toward him, wrapped in a shawl, sleep still clinging to her features. She looked surprised but deeply touched, her eyes softening at the sight of him elbow-deep in her truck. You didn't have to do this, she said gently, stopping a few feet away, cautious not to intrude too quickly into his space. Caleb shrugged, feeling uncharacteristically shy under her grateful gaze. It's not much. Just needed a new starter cable. Savannah's lips curved into a tender smile, one that warmed him in ways he didn't expect. Still, thank you. Caleb nodded, avoiding her eyes as he focused on finishing the repair. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't strained. Instead, it felt comfortable, natural even. It was Savannah who eventually broke it, taking a cautious step closer. "Last night meant a lot to me," she admitted softly. "Talking to you. It's been a long time since I told anyone about Mama." Caleb paused, wrench in hand, staring down at the engine. Her words resonated deeply. "It's been a long time since I told anyone about Emily too," he said quietly, the name escaping his lips like a prayer, raw and sacred. Savannah moved closer still, standing beside him now. Their shoulders brushed gently, and neither pulled away. Caleb's heartbeat quickened at the innocent contact, but he said nothing. Instead, he continued working, finding comfort in the quiet companionship. Finally, after a long pause, Caleb spoke again. "Why me?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with uncertainty. "Why did you tell me?" Savannah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because you understand what it's like to live with ghosts. And maybe, because I hoped you'd understand me." Caleb looked up, catching her gaze, surprised by the vulnerability reflected there. "I do understand," he said gently, surprised at how easy the admission came. "More than you know." Savannah's eyes shimmered, tears lingering but unshed. "Maybe that's why I couldn't leave you alone," she confessed. "I know what it's like to lose yourself in pain, to feel alone even in a crowd. I've spent my life trying to save people, hoping to fix something broken in myself." Caleb stared at her, struck by her honesty. "You don't need fixing, Savannah." She shook her head sadly. "I think part of me will always believe I do. I thought if I could just help enough people, I'd somehow make up for not saving my mama." Caleb felt a swell of protective warmth rise inside him. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the truck's fender. Her skin was soft and warm beneath his calloused fingers, and he felt her tremble slightly at his touch. "You can't save everyone," he murmured. "Sometimes you just have to let yourself be saved." Savannah's breath caught, eyes widening slightly. She squeezed his hand gently. "Is that what we're doing? Saving each other?" Caleb didn't answer immediately, but the weight of her question settled comfortably in his chest. He nodded slowly, voice quiet but steady. "Maybe we're trying." Savannah smiled softly, her eyes full of quiet hope. "I'd like that." He offered a rare, tender smile in return, feeling a spark of life ignite within him. "Me too." Caleb stepped back, releasing her hand reluctantly as he lowered the truck's hood. "It should start now," he said softly. Savannah climbed inside and turned the key. The engine roared to life, strong and steady. She laughed, bright and joyful, and Caleb felt something shift inside him at the sound, a quiet promise that life could still hold sweetness. She stepped out, approaching him with warmth radiating from her eyes. "How can I ever thank you?" "Just keeping you," he said simply. "You've already done more for me than you know." Savannah's eyes shone, and without warning, she stood on tiptoes, pressing a gentle kiss to Caleb's cheek. He froze, surprised yet deeply moved by the soft gesture. "Thank you," she whispered again before turning to walk back toward her cottage, leaving Caleb rooted in place, heart pounding in his chest. As he watched her go, Caleb realized that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to take slow steps forward. And for the first time in years, the future didn't seem so empty. Magnolia Falls buzzed with excitement. The annual town picnic was an event eagerly awaited by all, and this year, Savannah Leigh Monroe had volunteered to help organize it. The park at the heart of town was transformed, decorated with colorful banners, picnic tables draped in cheerful checkered cloths, and laughter echoing through the trees as families gathered together, sharing food, stories, and warm embraces. From a distance, Caleb Whitmore watched, leaning against an old oak at the park's edge. He'd come at Savannah's gentle insistence, though he remained wary of crowds. Still, seeing her in her element, bright and joyful as she moved effortlessly among the townspeople, warmed him more than he cared to admit. Savannah was a whirlwind of energy, her smile infectious. Children trailed after her, giggling as she passed out slices of watermelon and encouraged shy neighbors to join the fun. Yet, as Caleb watched closely, he began to notice something subtle beneath her vibrant facade. Moments when her smile faltered, when her gaze lingered too long on families laughing together, parents embracing their children with gentle love. It was fleeting, but he recognized it immediately, an ache, a longing for something she'd lost. He understood that pain. It mirrored his own. After a while, he saw Savannah slip away quietly, disappearing down a wooded path that led toward the small lake behind the park. Caleb hesitated only a moment before following, compelled by an unfamiliar protectiveness. The path was quiet, shaded by thick branches, dappled sunlight filtering through leaves above. Ahead, Savannah stood at the water's edge, arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared at the shimmering surface. Caleb approached cautiously, clearing his throat softly so as not to startle her. Savannah turned, eyes wide with surprise before softening at the sight of him. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said gently, her smile genuine but tinged with sadness. "You invited me," he replied, stepping closer. "Besides, I wanted to see you." Her cheeks flushed lightly, but her smile deepened. "I'm glad you came." Caleb nodded, standing beside her, his gaze drawn to the tranquil lake. Silence settled between them, comfortable yet filled with unspoken understanding. Finally, Caleb broke the quiet. "Are you all right?" Savannah exhaled shakily, her cheerful mask slipping just enough to reveal vulnerability beneath. "Sometimes it's hard," she admitted softly. "Seeing families together, children with their mamas and daddies. It reminds me of what I lost. What I never had." Her voice trembled slightly, and Caleb's heart clenched painfully. Without hesitation, he reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I understand," he said quietly. "I see you smiling all the time, but I know there's more beneath it. You don't have to pretend with me, Savannah." She turned, meeting his gaze with tears shimmering in her eyes. "I always thought if I could help everyone else, if I could fill their lives with joy, maybe I wouldn't feel so empty." "You're not empty," he whispered, his thumb brushing tenderly against her shoulder. "You're filled with so much love you don't know what to do with it." Savannah smiled weakly, a tear escaping down her cheek. Caleb instinctively reached out, brushing it away with gentle fingers. Her breath caught, eyes wide and vulnerable. He took a slow step closer, heart pounding. "I know what it's like to lose everything. But you showed me it's okay to feel again, to let people in. Let me do the same for you." Savannah stared up at him, eyes searching his face. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "I'm scared." "So am I," he admitted softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe together we don't have to be." A tender, trembling smile crossed her lips. She reached out slowly, her fingers threading through his. Their hands fit together perfectly, a gentle promise of something beautiful, something healing. "Come walk with me?" he asked softly, voice rough yet warm. She nodded silently, and hand in hand, they turned back toward the picnic. As dusk settled over Magnolia Falls, tiny lights began to flicker among the trees, fireflies, dancing gracefully through the air, illuminating the path before them. Savannah's eyes widened in wonder, a joyful laugh escaping her lips as she watched the tiny creatures float like tiny stars in the growing darkness. "They're beautiful," she whispered, eyes sparkling with childlike delight. Caleb watched her, entranced not by the fireflies, but by the sheer joy radiating from her in that moment. His heart swelled with unfamiliar warmth. "You're beautiful," he murmured without thinking, the words slipping effortlessly from his lips. Savannah turned to him, eyes softening, her lips parting in surprise. Caleb hesitated, suddenly unsure. But before he could apologize or pull away, Savannah squeezed his hand gently, stepping closer until there was barely any space between them. "So are you," she whispered, eyes locked onto his. Caleb's heart stuttered. Slowly, he leaned in, closing the small distance between them until their foreheads touched gently. His breath hitched, the intimacy leaving him breathless yet craving more. "Savannah," he whispered, voice raw with emotion. "I'm here," she replied softly, lifting her face slightly, lips inches from his. His heart raced, and in that tender, timeless moment beneath the stars and the flickering fireflies, Caleb closed the last gap, brushing his lips softly against hers. Savannah melted into him, her body fitting perfectly against his, their kiss gentle and tentative yet filled with the promise of something deeper, something true. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Savannah smiled up at him, eyes shining with quiet happiness. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked softly, thumb caressing her cheek tenderly. "For making me feel seen," she said gently. "For showing me it's okay to let someone in." Caleb smiled softly, holding her close beneath the dance of the fireflies. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Hand in hand, they walked slowly back toward the picnic, hearts entwined, knowing that something precious had sparked between them, something bright enough to illuminate even the darkest night. The next few weeks passed like a dream in Magnolia Falls. Caleb and Savannah found themselves drawn to each other more deeply with every passing day. Small moments became significant, morning coffee shared on his porch, quiet dinners in her cozy cottage, walks beneath the firefly-lit sky, hands entwined. The townsfolk whispered approvingly about their blossoming romance, pleased to see Caleb stepping out of his solitude and Savannah finding a home among them. But as they grew closer, Caleb found himself haunted by an unexpected feeling, guilt. It began as a whisper, an ache that gnawed at the edges of his heart whenever he caught himself smiling at Savannah's laughter or longing for her warmth. Memories of Emily, once comforting, now felt sharp and accusing, as though he were betraying her memory by finding happiness again. One evening, Savannah invited him over for supper. The cottage was warm, filled with the aroma of homemade chicken pot pie. Soft music played in the background, and Savannah hummed softly as she set the table. Caleb watched her quietly from the doorway, captivated by her effortless joy, yet the old ache tightened painfully in his chest. Savannah glanced up, eyes brightening at his presence. "You look miles away," she said gently, approaching him and slipping her hand into his. Caleb squeezed her hand lightly, offering a weak smile. "Just thinking." She studied him closely, sensing his unease. "Want to talk about it?" Caleb hesitated, torn between honesty and the desire to protect her from his inner turmoil. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head. "Not tonight. Let's just enjoy dinner." Savannah nodded slowly, though worry flickered in her eyes. She led him to the table, conversation flowing more easily as they shared the meal. But the shadow of his guilt lingered, coloring every laugh, every tender glance with uncertainty. After dinner, they moved to the small porch swing overlooking her garden. Stars glittered above, the air thick with the scent of jasmine. Savannah curled against him, head resting on his shoulder, fingers tracing gentle patterns over his palm. Caleb's heart ached with the sweetness of it, yet the guilt flared hotter, suffocating him until he finally spoke. "I don't know if I deserve this." Savannah lifted her head, eyes clouded with concern. "Deserve what?" "You," he said quietly, voice rough. "This happiness. It feels like I'm betraying her." Savannah's breath caught, eyes widening slightly. "Emily?" Caleb nodded slowly, pain etched across his features. "I swore I'd never love anyone else. But now here you are, and I can't stop feeling like I'm wronging her by loving you." Savannah pulled away slightly, hurt flickering across her face. "Do you regret this?" "Us." "No," Caleb said urgently, reaching for her hand again, but she withdrew slightly. "It's not about regret. It's about feeling like I don't have the right to move on, to be happy again." Savannah looked away, blinking back tears. "I thought we were healing together." "But if loving me makes you feel guilty, Savannah," he began, desperate to explain, but she stood, stepping away from the swing, wrapping her arms around herself. "I've spent my life feeling like a burden," she whispered, voice trembling. "Like I'm only worth something if I can help someone else. But I thought with you, maybe I finally found someone who saw me, really saw me. Not as someone to fix them, but someone worth loving." "You are worth loving," Caleb said fiercely, rising to stand before her, aching to reach out but fearful she'd pull further away. "More than anyone I've ever known." Savannah's eyes filled with tears, spilling quietly down her cheeks. "Then why does it hurt so much to know you feel guilty for loving me?" Caleb's heart twisted painfully. "Because I don't know how to let go of the past without feeling like I'm betraying her." Savannah wiped her tears, looking up at him with quiet sorrow. "Maybe you aren't ready to let go. Maybe I pushed too hard too soon." "No," he protested weakly, feeling her slipping away, panic rising within him. "Savannah," she shook her head sadly, stepping toward the door. "I can't compete with a ghost, Caleb. And I can't keep loving you if it means hurting you." His heart shattered at her words. "Don't go," he pleaded softly, voice breaking. "I need time," she whispered, voice trembling. "Maybe we both do." And with that, she slipped inside, leaving Caleb alone on the porch, heart aching, the shadows of his past wrapping tightly around him once more. Days passed, each one longer and emptier than the last. Savannah avoided him, and Caleb retreated into familiar solitude. His home felt unbearably silent, haunted by memories of two women now, Emily's laughter, Savannah's warmth. Finally, desperate for clarity, Caleb found himself standing before Emily's grave in the quiet cemetery on the edge of town. He knelt, placing fresh flowers gently at the headstone, his heart heavy yet determined. "I miss you," he whispered softly, tears burning his eyes. "I always will. But I can't keep living in the past. Loving Savannah doesn't mean I loved you any less." The words felt freeing, healing something broken within him. "I think you'd have liked her," he murmured. "She's kind and strong and beautiful. She brought me back to life. But I pushed her away." As he stood, a gentle breeze rustled the trees, and Caleb felt a deep sense of peace wash over him, as though Emily had given her blessing. With a final, grateful nod, he turned away, heart lighter, ready to find Savannah and make things right. But when he arrived at her cottage, his heart sank. Her old pickup was packed with bags, Savannah closing the door behind her. She froze at the sight of him, eyes wide with surprise. "Caleb," she whispered, uncertain. "Please don't go," he pleaded softly, stepping closer. "I was wrong. Loving you isn't betrayal, it's healing. Losing you would be." She hesitated, eyes shimmering with tears. "Are you sure?" "More sure than I've ever been," he said fiercely, taking her hands in his. "I can't imagine life without you." Savannah trembled, searching his eyes before finally stepping into his arms, pressing her face into his chest. "I love you," she whispered. Caleb held her tightly, heart soaring. "I love you too," he said softly, meaning every word. In that tender embrace, the shadows of the past finally loosened their grip, giving way to the gentle, hopeful promise of a future together. The gentle hum of evening cicadas surrounded Caleb and Savannah as they stood entwined in the fading twilight. Relief and joy mingled, wrapping them in a cocoon of warmth that chased away the shadows that had threatened to tear them apart. Savannah stepped back slightly, gazing up into Caleb's eyes with a vulnerability that stole his breath. "I was so scared of losing you," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. "But I didn't want to hold you back from moving on, from being free." Caleb gently cupped her cheek, thumb brushing softly against her skin. "You don't hold me back," he murmured, sincerity filling every word. "You set me free. You made me realize I don't have to stay trapped in the past to honor it." Savannah exhaled shakily, leaning into his touch. "I want to believe that, but part of me wonders if I'll ever be enough. If I can ever truly fill that empty place in your heart." Caleb shook his head gently, eyes fierce yet tender. "You're not here to fill an empty place, Savannah. You're here because you helped me realize my heart could grow bigger, big enough to love again. To love you." Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were joyful, relieved. She wrapped her arms around him, holding on tightly, as though afraid to let go again. "I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose us." "You won't," he promised softly, holding her close, feeling her heartbeat steady against his chest. "Not again." Not if I have anything to say about it. She smiled up at him, eyes shining in the growing darkness. I'm holding you to that. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I wouldn't have it any other way. They stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, until the sky deepened to a deep indigo, stars appearing one by one overhead. Eventually, Savannah pulled back, slipping her hand into Caleb's. Walk me home. Always, he said softly, a small smile playing on his lips. The short walk to Savannah's cottage felt peaceful, filled with the quiet intimacy they'd missed over the past few days. When they reached her porch, Caleb hesitated, still holding her hand tightly, reluctant to part. Stay, Savannah said softly, surprising him with the quiet request. Her eyes searched his face, hopeful yet cautious. Just for a while longer. I'm not ready to let you go yet. I'm not ready either, Caleb admitted, stepping closer. Inside, the cottage was cozy, filled with soft lamplight and the lingering scent of lavender. They settled on the couch, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed gently. Savannah leaned against Caleb, head resting comfortably on his shoulder, their fingers intertwined. For a long moment, they simply enjoyed each other's presence, hearts beating in quiet harmony. Eventually, Savannah spoke, voice soft yet filled with strength. I've spent my whole life trying to fix other people, she began gently. I thought if I could save them, I could somehow fix myself. But you taught me something important. Caleb tilted his head slightly, pressing a gentle kiss to her hair. What's that? That love isn't about fixing or saving. It's about being brave enough to let someone see you exactly as you are, and loving them enough to accept them the same way. Caleb's chest tightened with emotion. You taught me that too, he murmured. You saw past the walls I built and made me realize it's okay to feel joy again. To feel love. Savannah turned to face him, eyes shining with quiet determination. Then let's promise each other something. Anything, he replied without hesitation. Promise me that, no matter what happens, we won't hide from each other, she said earnestly. No walls, no pretending. Just us, honest and real. I promise, Caleb said fiercely, heart swelling. I don't want to hide from you, Savannah. I want you to know me, all of me. Good, she whispered, leaning in closer, eyes softening with warmth. Because I've fallen in love with every part of you, Caleb Whitmore. Even the broken parts. Caleb's breath hitched, her words resonating deep within him. He brushed his fingers tenderly against her cheek, voice thick with emotion. And I've fallen in love with every part of you, Savannah Monroe. Even the parts you think need fixing. A radiant smile crossed her lips, and she leaned in, closing the distance between them. Their kiss was gentle yet filled with a newfound strength, a silent promise to hold on to each other, no matter what challenges lay ahead. When they finally parted, Caleb held her close, their hearts beating in quiet sync. Savannah rested her head on his chest, eyes drifting shut with a contented sigh. Stay with me tonight, she murmured sleepily, a touch of vulnerability lingering in her voice. Caleb hesitated only briefly before nodding, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I'll stay. Together, they made their way to Savannah's small bedroom, where moonlight spilled through the open window, casting gentle shadows across the quilt-covered bed. They lay together, fully clothed, wrapped securely in each other's arms, hearts beating softly against one another. As Savannah drifted toward sleep, Caleb watched her peaceful face, feeling a deep, unshakable certainty settle within him. She had brought him back to life, teaching him that love wasn't something to fear, but something to cherish, to fight for, to hold on to tightly. And as sleep finally claimed him, Caleb knew, deep in his soul, that he would spend the rest of his life loving Savannah, honoring Emily's memory by choosing to embrace the gift of love once more. Outside, the fireflies danced gracefully, illuminating the night with tiny flickers of hope, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest moments, love would always guide them home. Morning light spilled softly into Savannah's bedroom, bathing the room in warm, golden hues. Caleb opened his eyes slowly, his heart stirring gently as he took in the sight beside him, Savannah sleeping peacefully, her features relaxed, free from the shadows that had haunted them both in recent days. She was beautiful, vulnerable in her sleep, and for a moment, Caleb simply watched her, heart swelling with gratitude and quiet wonder. Last night had changed everything. They'd laid their souls bare, opening doors they'd both long kept locked, choosing trust over fear. As he brushed a strand of hair softly from Savannah's cheek, Caleb knew that they had crossed a threshold. They weren't just two people falling in love, they were two souls choosing to heal together, to rebuild together. Savannah's eyes fluttered open, catching him watching her. A soft, sleepy smile curved her lips. "Good morning," she murmured, voice husky from sleep. "Morning," Caleb replied, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," she admitted softly, nestling closer against him. "It feels safe with you here." Caleb tightened his arms around her gently. "I feel the same. Like I'm home again." Savannah smiled softly, lifting her eyes to meet his. "Then maybe we both finally found where we belong." He nodded slowly, heart beating steadily in time with hers. "I believe we have." They lay quietly for a while longer, simply enjoying the newfound peace between them. Eventually, they rose and moved through the morning together in easy companionship, sharing breakfast in Savannah's sunlit kitchen. But as the day wore on, Caleb knew there was something important he needed to do, a step toward fully embracing their future. "Come with me somewhere?" he asked gently as they finished cleaning up. Savannah looked up curiously, drying her hands. "Anywhere." Caleb took her hand in his, eyes earnest. "I want you to meet my family." Surprise flickered in her eyes, followed by a tender smile. "I'd love to." A short drive brought them to a quiet, shaded farmhouse not far from Caleb's own property. It was his childhood home, where his parents still lived, tucked away among fields of wildflowers and ancient oaks. Caleb hadn't visited in far too long, the distance between him and his family growing in his grief. But now, with Savannah by his side, it felt like coming home. His parents greeted them warmly, surprise giving way quickly to joy at the sight of their son and the radiant young woman by his side. Caleb watched with quiet pride as Savannah effortlessly charmed them, laughter and warmth filling the house once again. It felt right, natural, like a missing piece finally falling into place. After lunch, Caleb's mother pulled Savannah aside, leaving him alone with his father on the porch. They sat in companionable silence for a while before his father spoke, his voice gentle yet firm. "It's good to see you happy again, son," he said quietly, eyes filled with understanding. "Emily would have wanted this for you. She'd have wanted you to find someone who makes you smile again." Caleb swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I know. It took me a long time to see it, though." His father placed a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Sometimes grief can blind us. But loving again doesn't erase what you had. It honors it." Caleb felt relief flood his chest. "I finally understand that now. Savannah helped me see it." His father smiled warmly. "She's special. Hold on to her." Caleb's gaze shifted inside, where Savannah laughed softly with his mother. "I intend to." That evening, as the sun dipped low over Magnolia Falls, Caleb and Savannah walked hand in hand down a familiar path toward the small lake where they'd shared their first vulnerable moments together. The air was thick with honeysuckle, and the fireflies were beginning their nightly dance, flickering gently in the twilight. Savannah squeezed Caleb's hand softly, a quiet question in her eyes. "Are you okay?" Caleb paused, turning to face her fully, his eyes clear and certain. "More than okay. Today meant a lot to me." Savannah's expression softened, eyes shining with quiet happiness. "Me too. Your family is wonderful. They loved you," he said gently, brushing a thumb across her knuckles. "And it felt good to be there with you, to share that part of myself." "I'm glad," she whispered. "I want to share everything with you, Caleb. The good and the hard parts." "I want that too," he replied earnestly. "For so long, I thought I had to hold on to my pain to honor Emily. But now, I see that loving you honors her even more. It honors the life she'd want me to have." Savannah's breath hitched, eyes filling with emotion. And I want to honor your heart by always being honest with mine. You make me feel safe enough to do that. Caleb stepped closer, cupping her face gently in his hands, his heart racing. You've given me a second chance at happiness. You've brought me back to life, Savannah. I love you more deeply than I ever thought possible. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. I love you too. More than I ever knew I could. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was tender yet fierce, sealing the promises made between them. As they pulled apart, Caleb wrapped her tightly in his arms, holding her close beneath the stars, the fireflies swirling gracefully around them. We're healing together, he murmured against her hair, voice thick with emotion. And nothing has ever felt more right. Savannah tilted her head up, eyes shining brightly. Nothing. Hand in hand, hearts intertwined, they stood by the lake, watching fireflies dance, a gentle reminder that, even after the darkest nights, love would always find its way home. The evening air in Magnolia Falls buzzed with the chatter of neighbors and the soft hum of fiddle music drifting through the town square. Lanterns hung from the old oak trees, casting a golden glow over the Firefly Festival, the town's most cherished tradition. Children ran barefoot through the grass, chasing the flickering lights of fireflies, while couples swayed gently to the slow, sweet melody played by the band on the wooden stage. Savannah stood in the middle of it all, heart full, taking in the warmth of the community that had embraced her so easily. But her gaze kept drifting, searching for one person, Caleb. She had spent years looking for ways to save others, trying to hold everything together for people who didn't always know they needed saving. But tonight, as she stood beneath the glow of the festival lights, she realized something. She didn't need to save Caleb. He had saved himself. And maybe, in loving him, she had saved herself, too. There you are. His voice came from behind her, warm and steady. Savannah turned to find Caleb standing just a few feet away, dressed in dark jeans and a button-down, looking devastatingly handsome under the twinkle lights. His eyes, those stormy blue-gray depths, softened when they met hers. You clean up nice, cowboy, she teased, a playful grin tugging at her lips. His mouth quirked in a half-smile, but there was something in his gaze, something deeper, something unwavering. I could say the same for you, he murmured, stepping closer. You look beautiful, Savannah. Her breath hitched as he reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch sent warmth through her, grounding her in the moment. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come, she admitted softly. Caleb exhaled, shaking his head with a small chuckle. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. She beamed up at him, fingers itching to reach for his hand. Before she could, the music changed, shifting into a slow, soulful tune, and the couples around them began to dance. Caleb hesitated for only a second before holding his hand out to her. Dance with me? Savannah laughed lightly. Didn't peg you for a dancing man, Whitmore. I'm full of surprises, he murmured, his eyes twinkling as she placed her hand in his. He led her onto the makeshift dance floor, wrapping his arms around her as they swayed gently to the music. Savannah rested her head against his chest, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat soothe her. I used to think this kind of happiness was something I'd never have again, Caleb confessed, his voice rough but honest. That I was meant to live in the past, alone with my ghosts. Savannah looked up at him, eyes shining. And now? His grip on her tightened slightly, his thumb tracing gentle circles along her back. Now, I know that love doesn't erase the past. It just makes room for something new. Her heart swelled, tears pricking her eyes. I love you, Caleb, she whispered, feeling the words deep in her soul. His hand came up to cradle her cheek, his eyes full of reverence. I love you, Savannah. More than I ever thought I could love again. The moment stretched between them, soft and full of quiet promises. Then, as the song reached its final notes, Caleb took a deep breath, his expression shifting into something even more intense, determined. I have something for you, he said suddenly. Savannah blinked in surprise as Caleb reached into his pocket, pulling out something small, something that gleamed under the festival lights. Her breath caught in her throat as he slowly dropped to one knee, holding up a delicate ring with a firefly engraved on the band. The world around them faded, the music, the people, the festival. It was just him and her, standing in the glow of fireflies and forever. Caleb's voice was steady, full of love, full of certainty. Savannah Leigh Monroe, you came into my life like a storm I didn't know I needed. You broke through every wall I built, showed me that love doesn't end with loss, it grows. You made me believe in second chances. I don't want another day to go by without you knowing that I choose you, every single time. Savannah's hands covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Caleb's voice softened, raw with emotion. Will you marry me? Savannah let out a breathless, joyful laugh, nodding frantically before dropping to her knees in front of him, throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, she whispered against his ear, her voice shaking with happiness. 1,000 times yes. Laughter and cheers erupted around them, but Savannah only had eyes for Caleb. He slid the ring onto her finger, pressing a tender kiss to her hand before capturing her lips in a kiss that was full of love, of healing, of forever. Fireflies danced around them, as if the universe itself was celebrating. Savannah pulled back just enough to rest her forehead against his, breathing him in. We made it, she whispered. Caleb smiled, brushing a thumb across her cheek. Yeah, darling. We did. Hand in hand, they stood together under the glow of the fireflies, knowing that their love had been forged in the hardest of times, but had emerged stronger, brighter, a love that would last a lifetime. The end.
Thank you so much for watching. All my stories are written by me, and I hope you enjoy them. I upload new videos daily, so I hope you'll hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I'd also love to hear what you think about this story in the comments, and feel free to tell me what kinds of stories you'd like me to bring to the channel in the future.